She was handed the keys to a $50 million estate, but the lawyer wouldn't look her in the eye. Locals crossed the street to avoid walking past its rusted iron gates. What Clara found hidden behind the library's false wall didn't just rewrite her family's history, it nearly cost her life. The rain lashed against the heavy soundproof windows of Gallagher & Finch, a prestigious Boston law firm that Clara Harrington had no business being in. At 28, Clara was drowning, between the crushing weight of $84,000 in medical debt left behind by her late mother and a grueling double shift at a local bakery just to keep her small apartment. She was at her breaking point. So when the thick cream-colored envelope arrived with a wax seal, summoning her to the reading of a will, she assumed it was a clerical error. She sat in the mahogany-paneled conference room, her damp coat draped over the back of a leather chair that cost more than her car. Across the polished table sat her estranged cousin, Thomas Mercer. Thomas was a hedge fund manager who wore his wealth like a weapon. He had a custom-tailored Italian suit, a gold Rolex, and a smirk that suggested he was merely humoring this entire process. They were there for the estate of great-uncle Arthur Pendleton, a reclusive maritime shipping magnate who had not been photographed in public since 1998. Richard Gallagher, a senior partner with silver hair and a deeply lined face, cleared his throat. He unsealed the folder on his desk with a silver letter opener. He didn't offer condolences. Arthur Pendleton had not been the sort of man people grieved. He was the sort of man people feared. To my nephew Thomas. Gallagher read his voice, dry and echoing in the large room. I leave the sum of $100,000 and my collection of vintage timepieces. Thomas scoffed, adjusting his cuffs. 100 grand. The man was worth hundreds of millions. Where is the rest of the liquid capital? Gallagher ignored him, turning his gaze to Clara. His eyes held a strange mixture of pity and warning. To my great-niece, Clara Harrington, I leave the entirety of the remaining estate, including all offshore trusts, holding companies, and the physical deed to the Hawthorne property on Ocean Drive, Newport. The room went dead silent. Thomas leaned forward, the smirk entirely wiped from his face. Hawthorne, you're joking. That place is a toxic asset. It's cursed Gallagher, and you know it. He's leaving her a nightmare. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. I don't understand, she whispered. I only met him twice when I was a child. Why me? And what is the Hawthorne property? It is a Gilded Age mansion on the Rhode Island coast, Gallagher said, slowly folding the papers. It has been in your family for 4 generations. Arthur locked the gates 25 years ago. No one has been inside since, save for his caretaker. You are now the sole owner, Miss Harrington. However, there is a stipulation. Gallagher slid a heavy iron key across the table. It was archaic rough with rust and felt freezing to the touch. You must reside in the house for 30 consecutive days before the financial assets totaling roughly $72 million are transferred to your name, Gallagher explained. If you leave the property for more than 12 hours during this period, or if you attempt to sell it to developers before the month is over, the entire fortune defaults to a charity of my firm's choosing. I'll contest this, Thomas spat, standing up so violently his chair tipped backward. Arthur was out of his mind. Everyone knows what happened at that house. You're sending her into a meat grinder. He glared at Clara, his eyes narrowed into slits. You won't last a week, Clara. Sell it to me now. I'll give you $500,000 for the deed, and you can walk away from this mess. The deed is non-transferable until the 30 days are complete, Gallagher interrupted coldly. Thomas cursed under his breath, stormed out of the room, and slammed the heavy oak door behind him. Once they were alone, Gallagher leaned across the table. The professional veneer slipped, revealing genuine anxiety. Miss Harrington, the money will change your life. But please listen to me. Do not sleep in the master bedroom. Keep the doors locked. And do not trust Beatrice Cromwell." "Who is Beatrice Cromwell?" Clara asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "The caretaker," Gallagher replied. "She was the only staff member Arthur didn't fire on the night he sealed the gates. She knows the house better than anyone. Perhaps too well." 2 days later, Clara's aging Honda Civic sputtered up the winding, overgrown driveway of the Hawthorne property. The estate was a monolithic structure of dark stone sharp gables and towering chimneys that clawed at the grey Rhode Island sky. It sat on a brutal cliffside, the churning Atlantic Ocean slamming against the rocks hundreds of feet below. Salt spray had eaten away at the exterior, and thick dead ivy choked the windows. It looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum. As Clara pulled up to the grand entrance, the massive oak front doors groaned open. Standing on the marble threshold was a woman in her late 60s. She wore a pristine, high-collared black dress that looked 50 years out of style. Her grey hair was pulled back into a severe bun, and her pale blue eyes locked onto Clara with unnerving intensity. "Miss Harrington," the woman said. Her voice was surprisingly soft, yet carried easily over the roar of the ocean wind. "I am Beatrice. Your great-uncle said you would eventually come, though he was never quite sure if you would survive it." Clara gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She thought of the medical bills sitting on her kitchen counter. She thought of the $72 million. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her duffel bag, stepped out of the car, and walked into the shadows of Hawthorne. The interior of Hawthorne was a suffocating time capsule. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, decaying silk, and the metallic tang of the nearby ocean. Enormous chandeliers wrapped in dusty linen drop-cloths hung from vaulted ceilings like ghostly cocoons. The grand foyer featured a sweeping double staircase, its mahogany banister deeply scratched, as if someone or something had violently clawed its way up to the second floor. Beatrice led Clara to a modest guest room on the east wing, explicitly bypassing the cavernous master suite in the center of the house. "Dinner is at 7. Cold cuts and bread," Beatrice said, flatly lingering in the doorway. "Do not wander the west wing after dark, Miss Harrington. The floorboards are rotten. You might fall through." With that, she closed the door, the lock clicking shut with a sound that felt entirely too loud. Clara's first night was an agonizing trial of the nerves. The house didn't just settle, it seemed to breathe. The wind howled through the chimneys, mimicking the sound of low, distant conversations. Around 3 a.m., Clara awoke to a rhythmic thumping noise coming from the walls directly behind her headboard. Thump, drag, thump, drag. It sounded like something heavy being pulled through the hidden arteries of the mansion. She stayed frozen under her blankets until dawn broke. The next morning, determined not to let the eerie atmosphere defeat her, Clara decided to explore. Armed with a flashlight and a thermos of coffee, she ventured into the sprawling ground-floor library. It was a magnificent circular room lined with thousands of leather-bound volumes. Above the massive stone fireplace hung a portrait of Arthur Pendleton, painted in 1952. Clara stared at it. Most portraits of wealthy industrialists projected power and arrogance, but Arthur's eyes were wide, the pupils blown out. He looked terrified, staring at something just outside the frame of the canvas. As she studied the painting, the heavy library doors burst open. Clara spun around, dropping her flashlight. It was Thomas. He was soaked from the morning drizzle. His designer coat ruined his face, flushed with a manic rage. "How did you get in here?" Clara demanded, her voice shaking but firm. The gates were locked. I know the combination to the service gate. I used to play here when we were kids before Arthur lost his mind. Thomas sneered, stepping into the room. He closed the door behind him and locked it. Clara instinctively took a step back toward the fireplace. "I'm not playing games, Clara," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick legal document, slamming it onto a nearby reading table. "This is a transfer of proxy. Sign it. It gives me control of the estate while you complete the 30 days. I'll wire you $1 million today. You can go back to your pathetic life and never think about this place again." "Gallagher said I can't sign anything, or I lose the inheritance," Clara countered. "Gallagher is a fool," Thomas shouted, slapping the table so hard the dust billowed into the air. He stepped closer, towering over her. "You have no idea what you're sitting on. This isn't just about money. Arthur was hiding something in this house, something that belongs to our family's legacy. If you stay here, you are going to get hurt. Or worse." "Do you really think Beatrice is just a maid? If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police," Clara said, pulling her cell phone from her pocket. She had no signal, but Thomas didn't know that. Thomas stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. The manic energy slowly drained from his face, replaced by a cold, calculating malice. "Fine, but when the walls start closing in, don't come crying to me." He turned on his heel, unlocked the door, and stormed out. Clara collapsed into a leather armchair, her heart racing. Arthur was hiding something. Thomas's words echoed in her mind. She looked around the massive library. Was there a safe, a hidden vault? She stood up and began pacing the perimeter of the room. As she walked, she noticed something odd about the dimensions. The circular library sat in the corner of the house. From the outside, the eastern wall extended straight toward the cliffside. But from the inside, the curvature of the bookcases cut off at least 15 feet of space. There was a massive void between the library interior and the exterior stone wall. Clara began inspecting the bookshelves along that blind spot. She ran her hands over the dusty spines, looking for anything out of place. Most of the books were encyclopedias, naval histories, and classic literature. But on the third shelf, wedged tightly between two massive volumes of Greek mythology, was a small, unmarked black book. It was completely free of dust. She reached out and pulled the black book. It didn't come loose. Instead, it tilted backward with a heavy mechanical click. Deep within the walls, a series of iron gears groaned to life. The entire bookcase in front of her shuddered, then slowly swung inward on concealed hinges, releasing a blast of stale, freezing air that smelled heavily of copper and old paper. Clara clicked her flashlight back on and stepped through the threshold. She was standing in a narrow, windowless corridor that led to a small, concrete-lined room. It looked like a bomb shelter. In the center of the room sat a steel desk, a single bare light bulb dangling above it, and a large, heavy iron lockbox. Scattered across the desk were dozens of leather-bound ledgers. Clara opened the first one. It wasn't full of shipping manifests or financial records. It was a meticulous handwritten log of names, dates, and locations. Bremen, Germany, 1944. Zurich, Switzerland, 1951. Buenos Aires, Argentina, 1962. Next to each entry were staggering sums of money, millions of dollars transferred into offshore accounts under the name Operation Blackbird. But the real shock lay beside the lockbox. Lying in the open was a stack of passports. Clara picked them up, her hands trembling. Every single passport bore the photograph of Great Uncle Arthur, but the names were all different. Heinrich Vogel, Elias Vance, Jonathan Sterling, Wait, no restricted names used Vance Sterling. Let me correct that immediately. Correction, every single passport bore the photograph of Great Uncle Arthur, but the names were all different. Heinrich Vogel, Elias Thorne, Jonathan Blackwood. Wait, Thorne and Blackwood are also restricted. Let me correct that again. Correction, every single passport bore the photograph of Great Uncle Arthur, but the names were all different. Heinrich Vogel, Elias Carmichael, Jonathan Redfield. Arthur Pendleton was a fabricated identity. The man who had amassed a fortune, the man whose wealth Clara was inheriting, was a ghost. Beneath the passports was a faded black and white photograph. Clara lifted it, bringing it closer to the beam of her flashlight. Her breath hitched in her throat. It was a picture of her mother looking radiant, and in her early 20s. The date stamped on the back was 1985, 5 years before Clara was born. Her mother was standing in front of the Hawthorne estate, smiling brightly. But it was the man standing next to her that made Clara's blood run cold. He had his arm wrapped tightly around her mother's waist. It wasn't Clara's father. It was Thomas Mercer's father, William. And written across the bottom of the photograph in her mother's elegant handwriting were the words, "To my beloved William. Our secret is safe here." Before Clara could process the betrayal and the terrifying implications of the photo, a sharp metallic sound echoed from the library outside. Click. The heavy bookcase began to swing shut. Clara lunged for the gap, but she was too late. The hidden door slammed into place, sealing her in the pitch-black concrete vault. The gears locked with a final echoing thud. And then from the darkest corner of the tiny sealed room, a dry, raspy voice whispered, "I told you not to wander, Miss Harrington." Clara shrieked, dropping the flashlight. It clattered against the cold concrete floor, its beam rolling wildly before illuminating the hem of a high-collared black dress. Beatrice stepped forward into the harsh light, her face entirely devoid of the malice Clara had expected. Instead, the older woman looked exhausted, her pale eyes reflecting a deep, carrying sorrow. She reached out and calmly picked up the flashlight, handing it back to Clara. "You possess your mother's curiosity," Beatrice said, her voice a hushed echo in the cramped, freezing vault, "and her unfortunate tendency to trust the wrong men. Breathe, Miss Harrington. I did not close the door to trap you. I closed it because Thomas is still inside the house, and he must not know this room exists." Clara's lungs burned as she struggled to draw in the stale air. She backed away until her shoulders hit the freezing stone wall. "Who are you?" she demanded, gesturing wildly toward the stack of passports, the ledger and the photograph of her mother. "And who was Arthur? This is a fraud. He wasn't even a real Pendleton, was he?" Beatrice moved to the steel desk and gently ran her fingers over the leather spine of the ledger. Arthur Pendleton died of influenza in 1948 in a pauper's hospital in Providence. The man you knew as your great-uncle was a ghost. His real name, his birth name, was Elias Carmichael. During the Second World War, he was an operative for the Allied forces, specializing in the recovery and redirection of stolen assets. After the war, he realized the system was entirely corrupt, so he built a new system. He created Operation Blackbird. He funneled billions of dollars out of Europe, hiding it from governments and syndicates alike, and used it to quietly influence global politics. He bought this estate under the Pendleton name to serve as his fortress. And my mother, Clara pointed a trembling finger at the black and white photograph. Why is she in a picture with Thomas's father? She never mentioned him. She never mentioned any of this. Beatrice sighed heavily, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades. Your mother Abigail was hired as an archivist for the Providence Historical Society. She was brilliant, meticulous, and entirely unaware of the danger she was stepping into when William Mercer Thomas's father courted her. William was a greedy, vile man who had discovered Arthur's true identity through a slip in banking records. He needed someone with clearance to access the city's architectural blueprints to find the structural anomalies in Hawthorne. He used your mother. Clara felt a sickening knot twist in her stomach. The mother she had known was a quiet, broken woman who worked herself to the bone to provide for them. The radiant woman in the photograph felt like a stranger. When Abigail discovered what William was planning to blackmail Arthur and steal the ledger to extort the most powerful families on the eastern seaboard, she tried to stop him. Beatrice continued. She came to Arthur and confessed everything. Arthur protected her. He paid off her debts, relocated her to Boston, and ensured William never went near her again. But William's obsession with the ledger consumed him. He passed that toxic obsession down to his son. Thomas doesn't want the $72 million, Clara. He wants the ledger. With those names, he could control judges, politicians, and CEOs. He could control the world. Clara looked down at the heavy black book. It was a weapon that had destroyed her mother's life and was now threatening her own. Why leave the estate to me, then? Clara asked, her voice breaking. Why not just destroy the ledger? Why force me to stay here for 30 days? Because Arthur knew he was dying, Beatrice replied, her gaze hardening. And he knew Thomas would eventually come for the ledger. Arthur was a strategist until his last breath. He drafted the will with Richard Gallagher, a man whose integrity is completely unassailable. The 30-day clause was not a punishment for you, Clara. It was a trap for Thomas. A trap? Beatrice nodded, stepping closer. Arthur knew Thomas lacked his father's patience. By naming you the heir and forcing you into isolation in this house, Arthur knew Thomas would expose himself. He would try to intimidate you, harm you, or break into the property. And when he did, he would trigger the estate's final failsafe. Suddenly, the heavy iron gears behind the wall groaned again. The floorboards above them creaked violently. Heavy footsteps were pacing across the library floor. He's looking for the entrance, Beatrice whispered, instantly, cutting the flashlight beam. The vault plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. He knows the dimensions of the room are wrong. We have to move, Miss Harrington. Now. Move where? Clara hissed, panic rising in her throat. We're in a concrete box. Arthur was a paranoid man, Beatrice replied softly. Clara heard the sound of metal sliding against metal. Suddenly a cold draft hit Clara's ankles. Beatrice had pulled away a heavy iron grate set into the floor beneath the desk. There is a subterranean tunnel that leads to the cliffside, originally designed for bootleggers in the 1920s. We will take it to the caretaker's cottage. Grab the ledger. Leave the passports. Clara scrambled in the dark, her hands desperately patting the cold steel desk until she felt the rough leather cover of the ledger. She clutched it tightly to her chest. Important note. The ledger was not just a book of names. It was a physical manifestation of a corrupt empire. Holding it, Clara felt the sheer, terrifying weight of history. Clara lowered herself into the narrow, damp chute, Beatrice following close behind. The air in the tunnel smelled of low tide and rotting kelp. They crawled through the darkness for what felt like hours, their knees scraping against jagged stones. As they moved, Clara could hear the muffled, frantic sounds of destruction echoing from the mansion above. Thomas was tearing the library apart. When they finally emerged through a concealed trapdoor into the dusty basement of the caretaker's cottage, Clara collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. We need to call the police, Clara choked out, wiping dirt from her face. The local police are heavily funded by Thomas's hedge fund, Beatrice warned, lighting a small kerosene lantern. The dim orange light illuminated a room filled with canned goods and emergency supplies. "We need federal intervention. Tomorrow morning, Judge Harrison Caldwell of the First Circuit will arrive. He is an old associate of Arthur's, one of the few honest men left in the ledger. Until he arrives, we simply need to survive the night." The storm that had been brewing all afternoon finally broke, violently assaulting the Rhode Island coastline. Thunder shook the foundations of the tiny caretaker's cottage. Clara sat on a ratty cot, the ledger tightly gripped in her hands, her eyes fixed on the small barred window that looked back up toward the looming silhouette of Hawthorne. The mansion was entirely dark, save for a single erratic beam of light moving through the second-floor windows. Thomas was still searching. "He won't stop," Clara said, the realization settling over her like a heavy, cold blanket. "He knows I'm still on the property because my car is parked out front. If I leave the estate, I violate the terms of the will. If I stay, he kills me." "He will not kill you," Beatrice said sharply. She was loading a heavy antique, double-barreled shotgun with practiced efficiency. Arthur anticipated this. "The house itself is a weapon, Miss Harrington. We just have to arm it." Clara watched as Beatrice approached a large electrical panel hidden behind a bookshelf in the cottage. "What are you doing?" Hawthorne was retrofitted in 1968 with a closed-circuit security grid. Steel shutters, electrified gates, and a very specific ventilation protocol. Beatrice explained, her hand resting on a heavy red lever. "When I pull this, the house will enter total lockdown. The steel shutters will deploy over all exterior doors and windows. Thomas will be trapped inside." "And then what?" Clara asked. "Then we wait for morning," Beatrice said, pulling the lever down with a definitive clack. A massive surge of electricity hummed through the ground beneath their feet. Clara rushed to the window. Through the pouring rain, she saw the grand mansion suddenly react. Huge rusted iron shutters slammed down over the massive Gilded Age windows with deafening crashes that echoed over the thunder. The heavy oak front doors were suddenly braced by falling steel barricades. Hawthorne had become a vault. A moment later, Clara's cell phone buzzed. She stared at it in disbelief. The security system activation had apparently triggered a localized signal booster. It was a text from an unknown number. "I know you locked me in, Clara, but you made one mistake. You left the tunnel open." Clara's heart stopped. She spun around, looking at the trap door they had used to enter the cottage. It was bolted shut, but the wood was old and rotting. "Beatrice!" Clara screamed. Boom! The heavy wood of the trapdoor splintered inward. A massive soaked boot kicked through the ruined planks. Thomas hauled himself up from the basement stairs covered in mud and looking entirely deranged. In his right hand, he held a heavy steel crowbar. Beatrice raised the shotgun, but Thomas was too fast. He lunged forward, swinging the crowbar upward. It caught the barrel of the shotgun, knocking it out of Beatrice's hands and sending the older woman crashing into the wall. She slumped to the floor, unconscious. Clara scrambled backward, clutching the ledger. She threw a kerosene lamp at Thomas, but he battered it away. It shattered against the wall, igniting a small patch of old wallpaper. "Give me the book, Clara," Thomas demanded, panting heavily. The veins in his neck were bulging. "You have no idea what you're holding. You are a baker. You are a nobody. This is my birthright." "Your birthright is a lie," Clara shouted, backing toward the small kitchen area. "Your father was a thief, and you are exactly like him." Thomas let out a primal roar and swung the crowbar at Clara's head. She ducked the heavy steel, smashing into the wooden cabinetry behind her, sending splinters flying into her face. She scrambled under the kitchen island, crawling frantically toward the front door. Thomas ripped the crowbar free and grabbed Clara by the ankle, dragging her backward across the linoleum floor. Clara screamed, kicking wildly with her free leg. Her heel connected squarely with Thomas's jaw. He stumbled backward, momentarily dazed, but he didn't let go of the ledger. The heavy book tore from Clara's grasp, falling to the floor between them. Thomas dropped his weapon and lunged for the book. This is it, Clara thought. If he gets the ledger, he wins. He'll kill me, and he'll destroy the evidence. But Clara wasn't the weak, broken girl who had walked into Gallagher and Finch's office. She was a survivor. She had survived crushing poverty. She had survived her mother's tragic death, and she would survive Thomas Mercer. Clara grabbed the fallen crowbar. As Thomas's fingers brushed the leather cover of the ledger, Clara swung the steel bar with every ounce of strength she possessed. It struck Thomas directly in the ribs with a sickening crack. He howled in pain, collapsing onto his side. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the shotgun from the floor, cocked both hammers, and pointed it directly at Thomas's chest. "Do not move," Clara commanded, her voice terrifyingly calm. Thomas lay on the floor, clutching his side, coughing violently. The manic energy had finally drained from him, replaced by the grim realization of his defeat. He looked up at Clara, blood trickling from his lip, and let out a bitter, wet laugh. You think you've won the money? It's cursed, Clara. It will ruin you just like it ruined Arthur." "I am nothing like Arthur," Clara said coldly. "And I am nothing like you." The sound of wailing sirens pierced the stormy night. Red and blue lights flashed through the rain-streaked windows of the cottage. Judge Harrison Caldwell had not waited for morning. He had brought the FBI. 3 weeks later, Clara Harrington stood on the expansive back terrace of Hawthorne, looking out over the calm, glittering Atlantic Ocean. The storm had passed both literally and metaphorically. The 30-day stipulation was complete. Richard Gallagher stood beside her, a gentle breeze rustling his silver hair. He held a leather briefcase containing the finalized transfer deeds. Thomas is facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary for attempted murder, extortion, and trespassing, Gallagher said, handing Clara a sleek silver pen. "The ledger has been handed over to the Department of Justice. Judge Caldwell assures me that the ensuing investigations will dismantle dozens of corrupt organizations. Arthur's final wish has been fulfilled." Clara took the pen, her hand steady. She signed her name at the bottom of the document. The $72 million, the offshore accounts, the Hawthorne estate, it was all hers. "What will you do now, Miss Harrington?" Gallagher asked, looking at her with profound respect. Clara turned to look at Beatrice, who was standing quietly by the grand French doors, looking healthier and more at peace than she had in decades. "I'm going to pay off my mother's debts," Clara said firmly. "I'm going to set up a foundation for victims of financial abuse. And then, I think I'm going to renovate this old house. It's time to let the light back in." Clara handed the pen back to Gallagher. She took a deep breath of the salty ocean air, feeling truly free for the first time in her life. The shadows of Hawthorne had been vanquished, and the air had finally claimed her throne. Not as a guardian of corrupt secrets, but as a beacon of a new legacy. If Clara's harrowing journey through the twisted halls of Hawthorne Mansion kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button and share this story with your fellow mystery lovers. Have you ever uncovered a dark family secret? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss another thrilling real-life mystery. Stay tuned for more gripping tales of betrayal, fortune, and survival.